The morning of June 4th, 1942, dawned over the Pacific with a silence that felt unnatural. Above the scattered clouds northeast of Midway Atoll, the sky stretched endlessly blue, empty save for the occasional seabird wheeling in the thermal currents. But that emptiness was deceptive. Hidden in the altitude, engines hummed, metal glinted, and in the cramped cockpit of a Grumman F4F Wildcat, Lieutenant James Butch O'Hare gripped the control stick with hands that had long since stopped trembling. His fighter was not beautiful. Compared to the sleek aircraft that ruled the skies over Europe, the Wildcat appeared almost comical. It was stubby, barrel-shaped, with wings that folded awkwardly and a fuselage that seemed too thick for speed. The Japanese pilots who had encountered it in the early months of the war laughed at its appearance, calling it the fat American bird, a lumbering relic suited perhaps for training flights, but certainly not for the ballet of air combat, where grace and agility determined survival. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, a machine born of elegance and sacrifice. The Zero was light, nimble, capable of outturning almost anything in the sky. It climbed faster, dove sharper, and danced through the air with a fluidity that made other fighters seem earthbound by comparison. Japanese pilots trusted it the way samurai trusted their blades, with a reverence that bordered on spiritual. To them, the Wildcat was a joke, a reflection of American excess, too heavy, too slow, too clumsy to matter in a real fight. But laughter, like so many things in war, has a way of dying when the first bullets strike home. The Pacific theater was no place for assumptions. Coral atolls dotted the ocean like scattered dice, each one a potential battlefield. Carriers prowled beneath the horizon, launching their aircraft into skies where survival was measured in seconds. And in those seconds, the difference between life and death often came down not to speed or grace, but to something more brutal: firepower, endurance, the ability to absorb punishment and still keep flying. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Wildcat carried 6 .50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing. When they fired, the sound was not a sharp crack but a guttural roar, a thunderous drumbeat that rattled the cockpit and sent tracers slicing through the air in streams of molten light. Each round was nearly 4 inches long, heavy enough to punch through aluminum skin, shred control cables, and tear apart engines. The Japanese had nothing like it. Their 7.7mm guns were precise but lacked stopping power. Their 20mm cannons hit hard but fired slowly, prone to jamming. The Wildcat's 50s, by contrast, were relentless, yet the Japanese did not see this as an advantage. They saw it as a weakness. Why burden a fighter with so much weight? They asked among themselves. Why sacrifice speed and maneuverability for brute force? The Zero philosophy was clear. A skilled pilot in a nimble plane could outfly any enemy, dodging bullets through superior agility. Armor was unnecessary if you never got hit. Heavy guns were pointless if you could not catch your target. The Wildcat, in their eyes, represented American arrogance, a belief that machines could substitute for skill. At first, they had reason for such confidence. In the early months of the war, from Pearl Harbor through the fall of the Philippines, Japanese Zeros swept the skies with devastating efficiency. They shot down lumbering bombers with ease, ambushed patrols, and turned dogfights into exhibitions of aerial supremacy. American pilots, flying outdated Brewster Buffaloes and early-model Wildcats, died in numbers that shook morale. The Zero seemed invincible, a phantom that appeared from nowhere, struck with precision, and vanished before retaliation was possible. Reports filtered back to American commanders, grim accounts of planes exploding mid-flight, pilots bailing out over open ocean, entire squadrons decimated. The Japanese laughed openly in radio intercepts, their voices crackling with contempt. They called American pilots cowards, their planes trash. The mockery stung because it carried a grain of truth. The Wildcat was slower. It could not climb as fast. In a turning fight, the Zero would circle behind it every time. But the Americans were learning. Slowly, painfully, through losses that carved names into memorial walls, they began to understand the nature of the fight. The Wildcat could not outdance the Zero, so it would have to outlast it. And to outlast it, The pilots needed to change not just their tactics, but their entire philosophy of air combat. Lieutenant Commander John Thach, a tactical genius with a mind for geometry and physics, studied the problem with the intensity of a mathematician solving an equation. He flew the Wildcat himself, felt its weight in his hands, understood its limitations. But he also recognized its strengths. The plane was tough. It had armor plating behind the pilot's seat, thick enough to stop rifle rounds. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with rubber that closed around bullet holes, preventing the catastrophic fires that turned so many Zeros into meteors. And those 650 caliber guns, when brought to bear, could shred an enemy fighter in seconds. Thach devised what would become known as the Thach weave, a defensive maneuver where two Wildcats flew side by side, weaving back and forth in a scissor pattern. When a Zero latched onto one plane's tail, the other would cross behind, bringing its guns to bear on the attacker. It was simple, elegant, and it turned the Wildcats' weaknesses into strengths. The Zero's speed and agility became liabilities in the weave. Pilots who tried to follow the turning Wildcats found themselves caught in crossfire, their unarmored frames disintegrating under streams of 50 caliber fire. The Japanese did not believe it at first. How could such a clumsy tactic work? How could slow, heavy fighters defend against the superior Zero? But belief, like laughter, shifts with experience. And the first time a Zero exploded in a ball of flame after chasing a Wildcat into the weave, doubt began to creep in. By June of 1942, the war had reached a turning point. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May had blunted Japanese expansion, though at terrible cost. Now, at Midway, both sides gathered for a confrontation that would decide the fate of the Pacific. The Japanese fleet approached with confidence, their carriers laden with Zeros piloted by veterans who had conquered half an ocean. They expected another easy victory, another demonstration of their aerial dominance. The Americans, outnumbered and outgunned, prepared to meet them with grim determination. Among the defenders were squadrons of Wildcats, flown by pilots who had studied the lessons written in blood over the Coral Sea and the skies above Guadalcanal. They knew they could not outfly the Zero. But they also knew something the Japanese had not yet learned. In war, survival is not about elegance. It is about endurance. O'Hare scanned the horizon, his eyes searching for the telltale glint of sunlight on metal. The radio crackled with chatter, voices tense but controlled. Somewhere out there, the enemy was coming. He thought of the briefings, the diagrams Thach had drawn on chalkboards, the stern warnings about engaging Zeros in turning fights. Stick to your wingman. Use the weave. Don't chase. Let them come to you. His Wildcat felt heavy beneath him, the engine growling steadily. It was not fast, not graceful, but it was his, and he trusted it. The guns were loaded, 6 streams of death waiting to be unleashed. The armor plate pressed reassuringly against his back. The fuel tanks, lined with self-sealing rubber, would not burn easily. He was ready. Then, on the edge of vision, he saw them. Black specks rising from the horizon, growing larger with each heartbeat. Zeros, dozens of them, flying in perfect formation, their wings glinting like knives. The Japanese were coming, confident as always, expecting the Americans to scatter, to panic, to die. But this time would be different. O'Hare keyed his radio, his voice steady. Bandits at 2 o'clock. Stick with your wingman. Remember the weave. The Wildcats banked into position, pairs forming up, ready to execute the maneuver that would turn their supposed weakness into the enemy's nightmare. The Zeros closed the distance, their pilots eager for another easy kill. They had laughed at the fat American bird for months. They had mocked its weight, its clumsiness, its inability to dance through the sky. But laughter dies when the first 50 caliber rounds tear through unarmored skin. And as the two formations converged, engines screaming, guns preparing to speak, the sky above Midway was about to witness a revelation. The Wildcat was not a dancer, it was a brawler. And in the brutal arithmetic of air combat, sometimes a brawler wins. The first pass happened in seconds. A Zero streaked past O'Hare's canopy, close enough that he could see the rising sun painted on its fuselage. His wingman, Lieutenant Edward Butch Barnes, fired a burst that missed by inches. The Zero pulled up sharply, its pilot confident, already beginning the turn that would bring him onto Barnes's tail. But Barnes did not try to outturn him. Instead, he rolled left, crossing O'Hare's path in a scissor maneuver. The Zero followed, eager, unaware of the trap. O'Hare rolled right, bringing his nose around, and there it was. The enemy fighter, exposed, turning hard but not hard enough. O'Hare's finger tightened on the trigger. 6 50-caliber machine guns roared to life. The Wildcat shuddered as the guns hammered, spitting tracers in a converging stream. The rounds walked up the Zero's wing, chewing through thin aluminum, punching into the fuel tank. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Zero erupted. Flame blossomed from its wing root, spreading instantly across the fuselage. The pilot, likely never knowing what hit him, disappeared into the fireball. The burning wreckage tumbled toward the ocean below, trailing black smoke like a funeral shroud. O'Hare felt no triumph, only grim acknowledgement. One down. But there were dozens more. The sky had become a chaos of twisting aircraft, tracer fire crisscrossing in lethal geometry. Wildcats and Zeros tangled in a deadly embrace, each side fighting with everything they had. But the pattern was emerging. The thatch weave was working. Every time a Zero latched onto a Wildcat's tail, confident in its superior turning ability, the prey's wingman would cross behind, guns blazing. The Zeros, built for speed and agility, had sacrificed armor for performance. They were masterpieces of engineering. Yes, but masterpieces with a fatal flaw. A single burst of 50-caliber fire could tear them apart. Their fuel tanks, unprotected, turned into bombs at the slightest spark. Their pilots, seated without armor, were exposed to every round that found its mark. The Japanese began to realize, with growing horror, that the fight was not going as expected. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced pilots, would later write in his memoir of the shock he felt engaging Wildcats over the Pacific. Their bullets came like rain. Our planes, so light, so fast, could not endure it. One hit to the fuel tank and we burned. We had thought armor unnecessary. We learned otherwise. The Americans, for their part, discovered that their Wildcats could take punishment that would obliterate a Zero. Bullet holes stitched across wings and fuselages, controls shot away, hydraulics leaking, yet the planes kept flying. The self-sealing fuel tanks prevented the catastrophic fires that spelled instant death. The armor plating behind the pilot's seat stopped rounds that would have killed them outright. Wildcats limped home with damage that would have turned Zeros into pyres. O'Hare's radio crackled. "Butch, on your 6. He glanced back, saw a Zero closing fast, its guns winking orange. Rounds snapped past his canopy. He shoved the stick forward, diving hard, feeling the G-forces press him into his seat. Barnes crossed behind, exactly as practiced. The Zero, committed to its attack, flew directly into Barnes's gun sight. The 50 calibers spoke again. Tracers converged on the Zero's engine cowling. Metal shredded, coolant sprayed. The engine seized, smoke pouring from the cowling. The Zero rolled over, its pilot struggling to control the dying aircraft, and plummeted toward the sea. 2 down. But the battle raged on. Above, below, all around, aircraft twisted and turned, hunting, fleeing, dying. The sky was stitched with tracer fire, dotted with parachutes and burning debris. The Japanese, accustomed to easy victories, found themselves caught in a meat grinder. Their Zeros, so elegant and deadly against lesser opponents, were being shredded by the concentrated firepower of American guns. The psychological impact was profound. For months, Japanese pilots had believed themselves invincible. Now, they watched their wingmen explode, saw their supposedly superior aircraft disintegrate under American fire, and felt the cold grip of doubt. The Wildcat was not supposed to win. It was slower, clumsier, inferior in every measurable way. Yet it was killing them. The Americans felt it too. A strange, fierce pride. Their planes were ugly, yes, heavy and slow and ungainly. But they were tough, and, in the crucible of combat, toughness mattered more than beauty. Every Wildcat that returned to its carrier, riddled with holes but still flying, was proof that American engineering had chosen wisely. Better to be slow and survive than fast and burn. By the time the engagement broke off, the ocean below was littered with wreckage. Zeros and Wildcats both had paid the price. But the balance had shifted. The Japanese had lost more planes, more pilots, more of the confidence that had carried them through the early months of the war. The myth of zero invincibility was cracking, and beneath it lay a troubling truth. Their fighters were fragile. O'Hare nursed his Wildcat back toward the carrier, his fuel gauge hovering near empty, his hands aching from gripping the stick. Beside him, Barnes flew in loose formation, his plane trailing smoke from a damaged engine. They had survived, not through superior speed or agility, but through firepower, armor, and tactics that turned weakness into strength. As they approached the carrier, O'Hare looked back at the empty sky behind them. Somewhere out there, Japanese pilots were doing the same, flying home with fewer wingmen, wondering how the fat American bird had managed to kill so many. The laughter had stopped. In its place was something new. And the dawning realization that this war would not be won by elegance alone. The Wildcat had spoken with its 650 caliber guns, and the message, written in fire and wreckage across the Pacific sky, was clear. The Americans would fight, and they would not be easy to kill. The carriers that evening were quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Men moved across the flight decks with purposeful silence, securing aircraft, checking damage, counting the empty spots where planes should have been. Mechanics worked under floodlights, patching bullet holes, replacing shredded control surfaces, draining fuel from perforated tanks that somehow had not ignited. The Wildcats that returned bore scars like battle trophies, metal skin puckered with entry wounds, wings creased where rounds had torn through. O'Hare climbed down from his cockpit, legs unsteady, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the cool evening air. A deck officer approached, clipboard in hand, asking for his report. O'Hare described the engagement in clipped sentences. 2 confirmed kills. Multiple hits scored. The weave worked. The officer nodded, scribbling notes, but O'Hare could see the question in his eyes. How did we survive? The answer lay not in heroics or luck alone, but in a philosophy of design that had seemed almost foolish at the war's outset. While the Japanese had built the Zero to dominate through speed and maneuverability, accepting vulnerability as the price of performance, the Americans had built the Wildcat to endure. It was a bet on different values. The Japanese believed a skilled pilot would never be hit. The Americans assumed every pilot would be hit eventually and designed accordingly. That assumption saved lives. In the weeks following Midway, as both sides licked their wounds and prepared for the grinding campaign ahead, the differences between the two fighters became impossible to ignore. Wildcats returned from missions with damage that would have been fatal in a Zero. Fuselages riddled with holes, tail sections shot away, engines leaking oil and coolant, yet the planes flew. Pilots landed with stories of being hit multiple times, feeling the impact of rounds against the armor plate behind their seats, watching fuel leak from punctured tanks that sealed themselves before fire could spread. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Zeros, by contrast, remained as fragile as they were deadly. A single tracer round through the wing could ignite the unprotected fuel tanks, turning the entire aircraft into a fireball in seconds. Pilots who bailed out told interrogators of the terror they felt, knowing that one lucky shot could end them instantly. The aircraft that had seemed invincible in the war's opening months was revealed as a gamble, brilliant in concept but built on a foundation of vulnerability. Japanese commanders recognized the problem but faced impossible choices. To add armor and self-sealing fuel tanks would add weight, reducing the Zero's speed and range, the very qualities that made it formidable. To increase armament would slow it further. They were trapped by the logic of their own design philosophy, and so the Zeros continued to fly, deadly but delicate, while the Wildcats absorbed punishment and kept fighting. The psychological toll on Japanese pilots was severe. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, who survived the war to write one of its most haunting memoirs, described the growing dread among Zero pilots. We learned to fear the American fighters not for their speed, but for their guns. When they hit, we burned. Our aircraft, so beautiful in flight, became coffins lined with gasoline. We flew knowing that a single mistake, a single burst of their heavy guns, meant death by fire. That fear changed tactics. Japanese pilots grew cautious, less willing to press attacks, quicker to disengage. The banzai spirit that had driven them to reckless courage in the war's early days began to erode, replaced by the cold mathematics of survival. When you fly a plane that can kill you as easily as the enemy, aggression becomes suicide. For the Americans, the opposite occurred. Confidence grew with each engagement. Wildcats that survived impossible odds became proof that their aircraft, ugly and heavy though it was, could be trusted. Pilots who had once envied the Zero's grace now understood that grace without protection was a fatal flaw. "Better to be the turtle than the hare," one pilot remarked. "If the hare catches fire at the first touch." The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August of 1942 reinforced these lessons in blood. Japanese carrier aircraft, including waves of Zeros, struck at American task forces with the fury of desperate men. The Wildcats rose to meet them, and once again the sky became a furnace. But this time, the Americans fought with the hard-earned knowledge of what worked. The Thutch weave had become standard doctrine. Pilots no longer tried to outturn Zeros. Instead, they baited them into traps, using their own agility against them. One engagement stood out. Lieutenant Albert Scooter Coffin found himself pursued by 3 Zeros, their pilots confident they had cornered easy prey. Coffin radioed his wingman, Lieutenant Marion Carl, and together they executed the weave with textbook precision. As Coffin broke left, Carl crossed right, bringing his guns to bear. The lead Zero, caught mid-turn, disintegrated under a sustained burst of 50 caliber fire. The second Zero, trying to follow Coffin through the maneuver, flew directly into Carl's line of fire. Rounds chewed through its tail section, severing control cables. The aircraft tumbled out of control, its pilot ejecting seconds before it hit the water. The third Zero, witnessing the destruction of his wingmen in mere seconds, broke off the attack and fled. Coffin and Carl returned to their carrier unscathed. Their Wildcats bore scars, bullet holes stitched across wings and fuselage, but nothing critical had been hit. The armor had held, the fuel tanks had sealed, the planes had done their job. Such accounts multiplied across the theater. At Guadalcanal, where the campaign devolved into a brutal war of attrition, Wildcats flying from Henderson Field engaged Zeros daily. The Japanese threw everything they had at the island, determined to crush the American foothold. But the Wildcats held the line, flying in conditions that would have grounded lesser aircraft. Through tropical storms and mechanical failures, they rose to meet every attack. The statistics tell part of the story. By late 1942, Wildcat pilots had achieved a kill ratio that stunned analysts. For every Wildcat lost in combat, approximately 1.3 Zeros were destroyed. Given the Zeros' supposed superiority, this should have been impossible. But the numbers did not lie. The Wildcat, dismissed as inferior, was winning. Yet numbers alone cannot capture the human cost. Every kill represented a life ended, often in flames. Every loss was a pilot who would not come home, a family that would receive a telegram, a name added to the growing list of the dead. The Wildcat pilots fought with grim professionalism, but they were not immune to the weight of what they did. O'Hare, promoted and decorated for his actions at Midway, later confessed in a letter to his wife that he dreamed of burning aircraft, of men trapped in cockpits as flames consumed them. The Japanese faced an even darker reckoning. As their most experienced pilots died, often cremated in the very planes they flew, replacements arrived with less training, less skill, less chance of survival. The Zeros remained as nimble as ever, but the men flying them could not exploit that agility. Green pilots made mistakes, and mistakes against Wildcats were fatal. The cycle spiraled downward. Losses begat more losses. The Imperial Navy's air arm, once the terror of the Pacific, began to hollow out. By 1943, the tide had turned decisively. New American fighters, the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, arrived with even greater firepower and performance. But the Wildcat continued to serve, particularly on escort carriers, where its rugged reliability remained invaluable. It flew ground support missions, strafed enemy positions, protected convoys, and in every role, those 650 caliber guns proved their worth. The Zero, meanwhile, became a symbol of fading glory. Japanese engineers tried desperately to upgrade it, adding armor and better engines, but each modification only highlighted the design's fundamental compromise. You could not make it tougher without making it slower, and speed was all it had left. By war's end, Zeros were being flown by teenagers with minimal training, sent on suicide missions, because there was nothing else left to do with them. The contrast between the two philosophies could not have been starker. The Japanese had built a fighter for the war they expected, one of short, decisive engagements where skill and speed would dominate. The Americans had built a fighter for the war they got, one of attrition and endurance where survival mattered more than style. The Wildcat was not designed to be beautiful. It was designed to bring its pilot home. Lieutenant Commander John Thutch, whose weave had saved countless lives, reflected on this after the war. The Zero was a magnificent aircraft, in the hands of a skilled pilot, but war is not a tournament of champions. It's a grinding struggle where the side that can replace losses and keep fighting wins. The Wildcat let us do that. It wasn't about being the best. It was about being good enough, tough enough, and numerous enough. That pragmatism defined American air strategy. While the Japanese clung to the myth of the superior warrior, the Americans embraced industrial might. Wildcats rolled off production lines by the thousands, each one identical, each one reliable. Pilots knew that if their plane was shot down, another would replace it. Replacements arrived with standardized training, flying standardized tactics, in standardized aircraft. The system was efficient, impersonal, and devastatingly effective. The Japanese could not match it. Their industry struggled to produce Zeros in sufficient numbers. Their training pipeline, decimated by losses, could not replace experienced pilots fast enough, and their design philosophy, elegant but inflexible, left them unable to adapt. The Zero that had dominated in 1941 was outclassed by 1943, and there was no replacement waiting in the wings. O'Hare did not live to see the war's end. In November of 1943, during a night fighter mission, his Wildcat was shot down under circumstances that remain disputed. Some accounts suggest friendly fire. Others blame a Japanese bomber's gunner. His body was never recovered. He was 29 years old, a recipient of the Medal of Honor, and one of the Navy's first aces. His name lives on in O'Hare International Airport, a monument to a man who trusted a stubby, ungainly fighter and proved that survival mattered more than elegance. The Wildcat itself retired from frontline service as newer fighters took over, but it never stopped flying. Escort carriers used them until the war's final days. They flew in the Atlantic, protecting convoys from German U-boats. They served in North Africa, providing ground support, and everywhere they went, they earned the same grudging respect. Not for beauty, but for toughness. Not for speed, but for reliability. After the war, historians and engineers studied the air campaigns with fresh eyes, trying to understand what had gone wrong for Japan and right for America. The Zero's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of over-specialization. By optimizing for a single scenario, the Japanese had created a fighter that excelled in ideal conditions, but collapsed when reality diverged from expectation. The Wildcat's story, by contrast, became a testament to pragmatic engineering. It was not optimized for perfection. It was optimized for war. Veterans of both sides, meeting in later years at reunions and conferences, spoke with mutual respect but different conclusions. Japanese pilots praised the Zero's handling, its grace, the way it responded to the slightest touch, but they also admitted, quietly, that they had flown knowing that death rode in every fuel tank, waiting for a single spark. American pilots praised the Wildcat's toughness, its guns, the way it brought them home despite damage that should have killed them. They flew knowing that their plane would protect them, even when nothing else could. The legacy of those early Pacific battles shaped decades of military aviation. The lessons learned over Midway and Guadalcanal influenced every fighter design that followed. Armor became standard. Self-sealing fuel tanks became mandatory. Firepower increased. The era of the fragile, agile interceptor gave way to heavily armed, heavily protected fighters that could survive the chaos of modern combat. The Wildcat itself became a museum piece, displayed in hangars and airports, its stubby frame polished to a gleam it never had in combat. Visitors walk past, reading plaques about its service record, its kill ratio, its role in turning the tide of the Pacific War. But the veterans who flew it see something different. They see the scars hidden beneath the polish. They remember the sound of 650 caliber guns hammering, the way the plane shook, the smell of cordite and hot metal. They remember burning Zeros tumbling from the sky, and the cold knowledge that without their plane's armor, they would have burned too. Some designs are timeless because they embody a truth larger than themselves. The Wildcat was never the fastest fighter, never the most maneuverable, never the most elegant, but it was tough enough, deadly enough, reliable enough to win when winning mattered most. In the skies above the Pacific, where Japanese pilots had laughed at its appearance and mocked its clumsiness, it became the instrument of their reckoning. The laughter died in flames, the mockery turned to fear, and the fat American bird, ugly and stubborn and unyielding, proved that survival is its own kind of victory. The Wildcat asked nothing of its pilots except courage and discipline. In return, it offered something the Zero never could: a chance to come home. When the last Wildcat was retired from active service, it flew into history with a record that spoke for itself. Not perfect, but effective. Not beautiful, but dependable. Not the best, but good enough to win. And in war, good enough is everything. The sky above Midway is quiet now, empty of fighters and gunfire, but the echoes remain. In the stories told by aging veterans, in the aircraft preserved in museums, in the names carved on memorials. The Wildcat and the Zero, locked forever in history's memory, represent two philosophies of war. One built on grace and accepted fragility, the other built on toughness and accepted weight. The Japanese chose beauty, the Americans chose survival. And when the smoke cleared over the Pacific, only one philosophy remained standing. The Wildcat had proven its worth in the only court that mattered, the sky itself, and though the laughter of those who mocked it has long since faded, the echo of its guns endures. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.